Well, thank you. I want to begin by, first of all, thanking all of you who are on this panel, not just for your testimony, but for your many years of work in this field. And a lot of your research and a lot of your recommendations over the years have been taken, obviously, very seriously, because I think that's why we are moving slowly but surely forward in trying to deal with these some of these terrible issues that we're talking about here today. You've given lots of recommendations. Some of them are easier said than done. You know, I'd say to Ms. Misra that nothing you said was unpopular to me, but I know it might be unpopular to some other members of this commission. But even when it comes to like organizing unions, it's tough to organize a union in the United States. So I think we could all kind of understand the value of organizing and workers having a greater say in the workforce. But in some countries, obviously, it's extremely difficult. It's hard here. I mean, it's even more difficult in other countries. I have a few questions, and I'm going to be going all around the place, so just bear with me. Just to kind of follow up on my last question to Ambassador Sidabarka, this is probably for Mr. Kara and Ms. Misra, if you care to comment on this. I go back to this tragic fire in Bangladesh. 112 people killed. Clothes bearing Walmart's brand, Faded Glory, were among the, in other Western brands, were being made in that factory. And we're talking a lot about, supply chain monitoring and all. Again, in this case, it's hard for me to believe that if there was supply chain monitoring, that somebody, I mean, I don't even think you have to be an expert on OSHA or on, worker safety issues. If just a kind of a cursory run through this factory would see that this was not a fit place for these people to work, and it was dangerous. And we're supposed to have supply chain monitoring going on. You both commented on kind of the some of the challenges with that, but I'd like to kind of talk a little bit more about that, if you don't mind. I mean, how do we strengthen that, and also dealing with the political realities that we have to deal with in this Congress, where additional regulations on corporations is not always very, very popular. Again, I want to give Walmart an opportunity to be a leader, and I want to be able to say nice things about companies and corporations, and but this case, and you mentioned a whole bunch of other cases, but reading about this case, it just seemed tragic and unnecessary, and it bothers me greatly that U.S. corporations are selling products that were made there, and so I think any comments you have would be appreciated. Mr. Kara, do you want to begin?
Well, let me first say and acknowledge that it's very important that this bothers you greatly, and I think the more people learn about these types of things, they too will be bothered greatly. So the question is, well, what do we do? I've been into a lot of these textile factories in Dhaka and other parts of South Asia. When I did the shrimp work, I also did the tea supply chain of South Asia and went into some of these textile factories as well. And I can tell you, when I walked out, these places are disasters waiting to happen. Stray electrical wires, intense heat, limited ventilation, doors locked, women doing the work while cradling a baby in one arm, who are breathing in all this terrible air and particulate matter. It was only a matter of time, and it remains only a matter of time. I think, to be honest, there's probably two ways that one can go about this, because there are challenging realities in that part of the world and other parts of the world where we source labor because it's economically beneficial to do so. We can take a top-down approach, pass laws, and say companies need to do this and do that, and you figure it out, which I think will, at this stage, probably be challenging and minimally effective. What I think is a more effective approach is to actually get researchers, academic researchers working with NGOs, to reliably document and quantify the extent to which these supply chains of these and that products are tainted vis-a-vis sale in the U.S. So I can tell you that 1 out of 57 shrimp in the world are tainted from Bangladesh. And we need to be able to say so many carpets, so many shirts at Walmart, Gap, etc. We've done the work. We've done the random sampling. It's tainted. Now, you're bothered by that. Consumers are bothered by that. And the pressure mounts that industry and government has to do something. And I think if we have that groundswell from the bottom up of consumer outcry, we may then have more leverage to get more effective policies done, more resources allocated, and tackling the really challenging side of this, which is the little last quadrant over there on the far side of the world where the work is being done, making sure we monitor that. And it is a challenge for companies, many companies, they're right. But if it comes from the consumer, I think we have a better chance of succeeding.
Ms. Bizra?
Support what was just said by making two important references to the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. The first is in 2000, the TVPRA was amended to apply on extraterritorial basis. So regardless where the act of trafficking is being committed, we are going to hold the corporation liable anywhere. And this happened in 2000 because of the Nepal accident in Iraq. So I believe this is really important to come and say our laws, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, shall apply outside the United States, regardless of where our U.S. corporation is outsourcing or conducting business. The second, which you just mentioned, in 2008, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was amended to focus on the consumer. Partnerships must be established to make sure that an American consumer is not buying goods that are being manufactured through child labor or forced labor. I think these are two very good provisions, and I think it's good for us to think about how can we effectively and adequately implement both of them.
Thank you. Ms. Bizra?
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. I too share Mr. Kahara's appreciation for you for just asking that question. I think that people wouldn't necessarily have seen the connection that you're seeing about a fire and an occupational safety and health issue being tied potentially to forced labor and other issues. A couple of things. I agree with you absolutely that it's very difficult to form a union, not just in the United States, but in many places around the world.
Doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Exactly, and I agree, and I keep that recommendation there. But there are steps in between that I just wanted to point out. And so I share, I think, Mr. Carr's recommendation about having NGOs and researchers monitor supply chains and make that information public is very important, but they have to do that in a way that makes sure there's worker agency. So if there's not a union in a workplace, workers are still the voice and need to be represented and have agency and ownership of being able to monitor that supply chain. So any NGOs or researchers who are doing this work need to make sure that there's that connection. And there are some examples. The Worker Rights Consortium in the U.S. does a very good job of that. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida also is a very good example of using codes of conduct and public pressure, but also using worker agency and voice as a way to monitor a supply chain. So pointing that out. You know, the Solidarity Center in Bangladesh has been trying to do fire and occupational safety and health training in factories all around the country, and has received funding from the U.S. government to do some of that, but have received a lot of pushback by the employers and the government itself. And I think that's one of the issues that we also need to look at, is making sure that there's an enabling environment for some of these things to happen. You mentioned Walmart, and since you mentioned it, I'm allowed to mention it.
Absolutely.
But Walmart is one of the world's largest employers. If they change, it changes the whole game. You know, we always say that if you can get Walmart to change, you're going to change the industry in lots of ways.
And I'm going to sound very naive here, but you know what I would like to think that would happen if I'm a U.S. company that is, makes zillions of dollars, and I am going to contract out with people in, whether it's Bangladesh, I don't care where it is, and being a good corporate global citizen, if I send somebody out to that location and see that it's a fire trap, or I have the hint that there may be forced labor going on, or I see some of the things that Mr. Carroll pointed out where, a mother is holding a baby in an environment that isn't safe. I would like to think that part of the response would be, to say we're not going to do business with you unless you kind of, clean this place up a little bit. And maybe, if we want to do business, we will help you do that because we earn lots of money and you're going to make us lots of money. So let us see whether we can improve the quality of the workplace here. To me, there just seems to be, there's an obligation beyond, what Congress stipulates or what Congress requires. It just, to me, it's just what we should come to expect. Again, it's not something that is a huge price tag that's going to put anybody out of business or make it not economically viable to have shirts made out of this place or whatever. It just seems to me that we ought to be expecting that of corporations in the United States and around the world. I mean, you want to be a good corporate citizen, and you are exploiting cheap labor. That's why you're going to some of these places. You ought to make sure that the workplace is safe. You ought to make sure that there isn't this going on. And again, in this case here, it just seemed to me that even somebody who is not trained, as you are, to look at these things, would walk away saying, boy, there are lots of problems here. We ought to look into this. So anyway, I interrupted you, but it's just kind of, when I read about this, that was, I don't think anybody intentionally wants bad things to happen. It's just that if you're going to do business, you ought to have an obligation to the people that are making the product that you're selling.
So I kind of wish you were the chairman of Walmart also. Yeah. So you say that, and it seems like common sense, but unfortunately, I'm trying to be nice. So unfortunately, that's not the case. I mean, another example, let's talk about Apple in China and Foxconn. I mean, there was all this publicity last year about forced labor, forced overtime, et cetera, in the iPad. And then just last month, we heard more reports of forced student labor being used to make the new iPad mini or whatever it's called. I mean, there was all this publicity. Apple had to respond. The FLA got involved. You would think that this attention would have made changes. And yet, just last month, we heard of more cases of forced labor going on in China and Foxconn. And so, unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be enough. I think one of the frustrations that we continue to have is that people continue to promote codes of conduct as the solution, and it's not the solution because they're not enforceable mechanisms. We need to figure out ways to find enforceable mechanisms. Another thing that I would just point out, and I said this earlier, is the role of ICE. I mean, we have a very good law on the books that says products made with forced labor and child labor cannot come into the United States, and yet it's enforced very little because it's very hard right now for ICE to prove that case, and we need to figure out ways, whether it's through regulation or other ways, for ICE to be able to do that a little bit more easily. Because I think once these companies start getting not being allowed to bring their products into the United States, that'll make a big difference. So,
I don't know whether Ms. Ellison, you have anything to add to any of this, or.
I would just really say that it's interesting how much some of the themes that have been raised by my colleagues that are occurring in other countries really are some of the same things that we're seeing in the United States. It may not be to the same, staggering extent in all places, but some of the same themes really do exist. And so I think looking at it internationally and globally is really the right way to go.
Well, let me just ask you, since you have your microphone on here. I mean, U.S. corporations, are in many ways involved, whether unwittingly or not, in facilitating the practice of forced labor and trafficking. But these companies are often not held accountable for monitoring their supply chains in foreign countries to ensure that they are free of these abusive practices. I'm just trying to, what ways can the U.S. government increase legal accountability of these companies, and how can companies improve their own practices to avoid being implicated in these human rights abuses?
Right. Well, I do think that, thank you for that question, I do think that we have some good models to look at. As many of you probably know, the California Supply Chain Transparency Act has been in place now, and that has been beginning to take hold. There are basically lawyers that are now beginning to help companies in the United States that are doing business both here and elsewhere to look at their supply chains and to become more accountable. We do have legislation pending here in Congress that is sponsored by Congresswoman Maloney, the Supply Chains Transparency Act, H.R. 2759, that is pending now, and that is something that I think would even extend what California has done and make it a federal law that would apply to all companies, and I think go a long way to help to have companies know that they should be accountable.
Okay. I want to ask a bunch of questions here to each of you kind of individually, and it's going to sound like I'm kind of just shooting things at you, but we have to be out of here by 4, so I want to make sure that I get some of these questions in, if that's okay with you. And by the way, let me say before I even begin, you know, if you have specific suggestions, you know, of things that we can do legislatively, or things that we can do in terms of, you know, pressuring our government or other governments, you know, maybe Mr. Carr's suggestion is actually not a bad one, that in the short term, because it's going to take a while to get some of the stuff, you might want to take a congressman or two out to some of these places where these abuses are occurring, especially if, in fact, U.S. corporations are buying things from there. You know, that may be one way to kind of put a little pressure on kind of cleaning things up. So, you know, we ought to think about that as well. But, you know, when you leave here, I hope that the collaboration with this commission doesn't end there, that if you know, we're a lot of us who want to be helpful here and always are trying to figure out ways that we can kind of advance the cause. But Mr. Carr, let me ask you a question here. Domestic legislation such as the Bonded Labor, the Abolition Act of 1992, and the Pakistani Penal Code have proven ineffective in curtailing the bonded labor system in Pakistan, which systematically enslaves primarily poor Hindus, Christians, and other religious minorities in rural Sindh and Punjab. Moreover, local government officials and law enforcement have been uncooperative in ending the practice and securing the release of bonded laborers. So given the entrenchment of the system in rural Pakistan, what specific legal reform should the Pakistani government undertake at the national and provincial levels to restrain the practice, and what role can and should the United States play in such a reform effort?
Well, you didn't give me an easy one. The situation in Pakistan is deeply troubling. There are factors there that are similar to India, Nepal, Bangladesh from a debt bondage standpoint. Pakistan does have a bonded labor abolition law, 1992, modeled after India's 76 Act. In fact, Nepal also has a law they passed in 2000, and Bangladesh still does not have a law that even recognizes bonded labor. You're absolutely right. It is fundamentally minority in Pakistan, minority Hindus and Christians who are on the wrong end of these debt bondage agreements and have historically been so, and are the ones who I described earlier as describing themselves as being traded like livestock, tortured in prisons, and caught in relentless cycles of bonded labor. So what do? There's a law, yet the situation persists. I think there has to be some very strong, high-level diplomatic outreach to Pakistan from a human rights standpoint, coupled with economic aid that puts some levers here. That economic aid has to become contingent on future economic aid, on elevating some of these human rights violations, and bonded labor, in particular exploitation of Hindus and Christians in Sindh province and Punjab province, has to be near the top of the list. I think the treatment of women has to be also near the top of the list when we're talking about Pakistan. There's endemic corruption and apathy in these deep rural areas. Upper caste groups control the politics, control law enforcement, control the judiciary, and so there's very little recourse for the people who are exploited. So we have to go in and make sure these people have a voice. If that means one or two congressmen or their staffers coming out with someone like me and seeing bonded labor and then speaking about it, that's giving them a voice, and that applies pressure. I think providing tactical as well as technical assistance to Pakistan of how do you identify bonded laborers, how do you prosecute these cases, you do have a law, and how do you re-empower these people so that the cycle of exploitation is broken. And that re-empowerment element stands true of all forms of human trafficking, all forms of child labor, all forms of exploitation. That's the missing element from the standpoint of the global response to this issue. Many more specific ideas I could share with you or your staffers afterwards
I'd
vis-a-vis
appreciate
this
that.
issue. One quick thing I wanted to add to the corporate issue in the supply chains. We have to make the reality such that a company like Apple has to spend as much time defending against claims vis-a-vis labor exploitation as they do defend their patents against Samsung. I mean, right now, that balance is just not there. So they have to be spending as much time on labor issues as they are on their patents. And finally, it's not sufficient to just make sure the supply chain is clean, but if our companies are going to benefit from the labor environments on the far side of the world, whose low wages are often driven by poverty and a lack of alternative, I think we have an obligation, and I'd like to see this in the reauthorization or in a future law, for those companies to also invest in those communities, to provide education and clothing and medical care for children, for women, so that slowly but surely we're no longer sourcing labor around the world in environments of poverty, but there's a community that can benefit and also enjoy the fruits of the global economy as much as we do as consumers here in the West.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mattar, issue question. Trafficking in persons appears to be a significant problem in all the Gulf monarchy states, as you mentioned. In the State Department 2012 Trafficking in Persons report, none of the 6 states in the Gulf Cooperation Council are ranked above Tier 2. 2 of these countries, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, are in Tier 3, which is the worst level. What is the United States doing to assist and encourage improved performance on the part of Gulf states to curb trafficking in persons? And why do you think the Gulf states have such poor records in combating trafficking in persons?
This is really an excellent question. If you take a look at the TIP report and ask the question, how are we doing in the Gulf states and in the Arab world in generally, you may conclude that we're doing very poorly. When I say we, I mean the Arab governments. None of the Arab states are listed in Tier 1. Never happened except twice. Morocco one time was on Tier 1, and United Arab Emirates was on Tier 1 in one of these years. But if you take a look at the 12-year record of the TIP report, none of the Arab countries are on Tier 1. This is really something that we're studying. Also, in this last report, only 6 countries are on Tier 2. While you have 7 countries on Tier 2 watch list and 7 other countries on Tier 3. It means that if you add 7 and 7, almost 14 countries are either on Tier 2 watch list or on Tier 3. So the question is why? In this part of the world, many of these countries rely on foreign labor. And they do not provide the same protections, labor protections, to foreign labor as they provide to their nationals. So this is number one. This has to change. This policy of discrimination against foreign labor must go away. Second, if you take a look at the legislative movement in these countries, especially the Gulf states, there are laws. And I mentioned that we have 13 of them up till now. These are all new. It's time to implement these laws. Some of them, I believe, are good laws. I remember Article 26 of the Egyptian law on human trafficking, providing for the establishment of a state fund. So we're trying here to compensate victims and help victims. But where is the state fund? When was it created? Is it functioning? That's the question. I remember Article 9 of the Syrian law. It provides for the liability of the customer. And I am really support going after demand and after the customer. But the question, are we prosecuting any customers when they involved in sex trafficking? I did not see any cases that involve prosecution of demand. In fact, if you take a look at prosecutions in this part of the world, there are just very few of them. Aside from perhaps Egypt, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, hardly any other Arab country prosecute cases of human trafficking. Also, our approach to victims. In many Arab countries, we still treat the trafficked person as a criminal. So we arrest a victim of trafficking, we apprehend her, and we put her behind bars instead of identifying her as a victim and a victim that is entitled to basic human rights. Again, this culture has to change. So there is no really easy answer. How can we change the record? What is the U.S. doing? I think the U.S. is doing a good job. I asked the question several times. If you take a look at this legislative movement, and if you take a look at the institutional changes in some of these countries, and ask the question, why is this happening? I can make a statement now that this is happening because of the U.S. policy. I think the U.S. policy is working. I think the TIP report is working. Some of these countries are moving slowly from Tier 2 watch list to Tier 2. Some of these countries are also moving from Tier 3 to Tier 2 watch list. Let's continue the U.S. constructive engagement policy, and hopefully things will change.
Thank you. Ms. Misra, during President Obama's recent trip to Burma, he signed an agreement with the President of Burma to implement the International Labor Organization plan to eliminate forced labor. How might the reemergence of armed conflict in parts of Burma, particularly in Kachin and Rakhine states, affect forced labor trends in Southeast Asia, and what can the U.S. do to help implement this plan, and how should the United States and other groups, such as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, address the issue?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually not our expert on Burma, so I'm going to answer your question, but I'd like to, if we could,
sure,
offline, please bring in our people who are experts. And actually, our regional program director for Asia is on his way on a plane right now to Burma. And so I know he would have better answers to your question. A couple things on that. One, when Burma started opening up after the opportunities that have arisen, we heard that the ILO was giving Burma 3 years to address their forced labor problem, and we were a little taken aback by that. Forced labor is a huge problem, but it's in some ways easily identified, and 3 years to us seemed like way too long to give them an opportunity to address the issue. Also on the role of ASEAN, as I mentioned, I worked in our office in Indonesia for many years, and unfortunately, ASEAN hasn't been as much of a leading voice as we'd like to see on issues of human rights in general, but human trafficking and forced labor in particular. They didn't push very hard on Burma on their forced labor issues or the issues that we were seeing on exploitation of Burmese migrant workers, for example, in Thailand. And so while the role of ASEAN is really important, I think that as much as the U.S. can do to push them to move a little bit faster and further on those issues would be very important. I mean, again, the issue of armed conflict is very troubling, and I think I'm going to leave that to.
I look forward to getting the report when he gets back.
Can I just address one thing before we move on? Just in response, Mary mentioned the California Supply Chain Act that went into law in January 1st, and Mary's organization and mine are both part of a coalition called the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, or ATTEST. It's a coalition of 12 anti-trafficking organizations, and we've been engaging on a project to look at how companies have been responding to that law, and they all have up until this month, or actually, this month, to comply with it. And basically, all they have to do is make publicly aware what they're doing to combat forced labor, right? And we were hoping that we could find a couple model companies that then we would use to engage with others. We have not found a single one. And the response to the law has been dismal. The things that people are putting on their websites to say they comply with it, what they're doing to eliminate forced labor has been very weak and extremely disappointing. And so I just wanted to point that out, because while it's an important first step, I think, and we're engaging with the Attorney General's office in California to try to push companies to respond better to it, but it's been very worrying. I also just wanted to mention, Mr. Kara mentioned companies investing in communities. When they do that at the same time, I hope that we could push them to pay a living wage. One of my frustrations is that you'll see companies go in and do corporate social responsibility where they build a school or a hospital while at the same time they're not paying overtime or minimum wage to their workers. If you actually pay workers a living wage, that would go a long way, I think, in eliminating poverty too. And then just the last 2 points, I'm sorry. On Pakistan and bonded labor, we have an office also in Pakistan, and our person there says that he has a game changer on the issue of bonded labor, and we haven't figured out how to do it yet, so I want to present it. One of the things that we've seen, another colleague of ours from a test in IJM said that in Afghanistan, if you want to build, the World Bank or the U.S. Government is building some sort of building, it's really impossible to build it with bricks that aren't made with bonded labor. The same is true in many parts of Pakistan, India. And so one of the game changers that our person in Pakistan says is we need to figure out a way, if the U.S. government, the World Bank, and others are sourcing to build some sort of infrastructure project, we have to figure out a way to be able to build that without bonded labor. And if they pick, if they find a way to do that, that'll be huge. And then just on the GCC countries, one of the things that we see, we also have an office in Doha, Qatar, and one of the things that we see that they do a lot is they blame the origin countries for the problems. They say the debt bondage happens in Indonesia, the debt bondage happens in Nepal, but the power really is with the Qatari government, with the Kuwaiti government, the UAE. If they told these origin countries that you had to be better about debt bondage, labor recruiter issues, they would do it because they want to send their workers to the GCC, and they're not doing that right now. And so the thing that I was saying earlier about multilateral agreements and pushing that, I think that would be very important. And then just the last word on this, and I'll stop, is that the World Cup, as I said, presented an opportunity, but we're seeing that really the leverage points in the GCC are all about reputation, that these governments really want to be seen as international destinations, tourist destinations, etc. And by naming and shaming, changes are being made in those countries, and that should continue. Thank you.
No, and I appreciate that, and I'm going to ask Ms. Ellison a question that I'm going to ask all you to respond to it, because we're running out of time here, unfortunately, because this has been a really excellent panel. Before I ask the question, let me just kind of reiterate what I said before. I mean, I think we are interested in finding ways, to advance the cause here, and there are some things that are doable quickly, and there are some things that are going to take some time. I just want to make sure, at the very minimum, we're doing the doable. And finding ways to kind of elevate this issue. So there may be, we're doing a hearing today, but I mean, there are opportunities for briefings. There are opportunities, again, for us to, pressure our government, other governments, as causes, as issues may arise. I hope that you will call the staff, or you will call me. We will engage in this, because I mean, this is a huge problem. And again, I mean, you know how it works here, because you're all familiar with the way Washington is. People just get obsessed with 1,000 different things every day. And as a result, a lot of times really important issues fall through the cracks. And I listened to which brings me to my final question, listening to the ambassador speak and listening to all the incredible work he and his staff are doing with very little resources. Leveraging a relatively small amount to do an awful lot, which I wish I could wave a wand and expand his budget. Can't do that, unfortunately. We'll try, but can't guarantee that. Which brings me back to these things that we talked about before. I mean, how do you, whether it's bringing members of Congress to places where labor is being exploited, and demanding that U.S. companies adhere to a better code, which I think is, I think is a reasonable ask. And I'll tell you, for myself as a consumer, I like to buy things from people who treat other people well. I mean, I'll pay a little bit more for a product if I know it's. I mean, I always buy fair trade coffee, and I mean, because I've seen places where workers on coffee plantations in Latin America have been exploited. I mean, those are things that are important to me as a consumer. So I don't think it's, necessarily a burden on business to do the right thing. In fact, I think it makes it more likely that people will want to support that business. So this is kind of an obligatory question because we are where we are, but the Trafficking Victim Protection Act has expired since the first time, since its passage in 2000. If the bill is not reauthorized, there's a risk of substantial loss of funding next year. And I guess I want to start with you, Ms. Ellison, and go down. I mean, what are the potential consequences of not reauthorizing this bill? I mean, not only in terms of funding, but what it says to the world in terms of our commitment on this issue.
You couldn't have said it better yourself, that this is a message that we send to the entire world, that human trafficking and modern-day slavery is a significant problem, it's a human rights violation, it's a heinous crime, and that we must continue to address it. And the best way that we've found to address it around the world is through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It sets up the entire framework for addressing it here in the United States and around the world. If we don't reauthorize it, it would be like allowing the 13th Amendment to lapse. It's that serious. It's our modern day implementation of the 13th Amendment, and so it's extremely serious. On a practical level, it means that authorizations and funding, are in jeopardy, and we need to use those funds to operate things like the National Hotline, to provide victim services for victims here in the United States, to fund the great work of the State Department in all countries around the world, to continue to publish the TIP report, which obviously raises the bar for all the countries around the world to know that they are being held to account. So it would be devastating to not reauthorize this law.
Thank you. Ms. Misra?
I would just agree with Mary and the statement you made, Mr. Chairman. It was extremely disappointing to us that since 2000, the TVPRA has been reauthorized on a bipartisan basis, and it's just this year that it's been caught up on some partisan issues and did not get reauthorized in time. And I think for the Solidarity Center's work, one of the things that we do in working with governments and civil society overseas is use the U.S. as a model as much as we can. And when we're pushing for laws and implementation in other countries and we don't have that here, that's really doing a huge disservice. Just the last thing I would say is in the TVPRA, it's come in and out. There's been provisions that Attest and Solidarity Center have been advocating for on regulating foreign labor recruiters. And 10 years ago, you never would have had that. We've come a long way in understanding how regulating foreign labor recruiters is really important. But unfortunately, sometimes I think people see it just as an immigration issue and not as a trafficking issue, and it really, really is. So I would just want to add a little something to your question and say if the TVPRA, when hopefully the TVPRA is reauthorized, I hope that the foreign labor recruiter provisions will be reconsidered, because I think it's one of the major issues we need to deal with in preventing human trafficking.
Well, if it comes to the Rules Committee, I'm on the Rules Committee. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to offer amendments if it comes that way. Dr. Matara?
Yeah, I would say definitely we need the new reauthorization, but not only for purposes of funding. To me, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act serves as a good model of how can we have a law to combat human trafficking and keep working on this law to provide more protections and to expand what we consider as human trafficking. This law was adopted back in October 28, 2000, and reauthorized 3 times, 2003, 2005, 2008. And every time we reauthorize the act, we provide a model to the world on how can you strengthen protections given to victims of trafficking. When we first started, we did not allow victims of trafficking to file a civil action asking for compensation. This changed in 2003. And then in 2005, we told the world, now we have new minimum standards to eliminate human trafficking. And we're going to add other standards like child sex tourism, for example. It was not part of the original act. This is how I look at the reauthorization. I look at it not as a way of continuing funding, and we have to fund these efforts to combat human trafficking, but to serve as a model on how can we expand liability and how can we strengthen protections that are given to victims of trafficking.
Mr. Kara?
Very briefly, if we fail to reauthorize the TVPA, we're sending the message that the U.S. and the world is open for business for human traffickers, plain and simple. I've spoken to traffickers, and they've told me with some pride, and people who exploit forced labor, we have more will and dedication than our opponents do. I mean, this is how they see it, and failure to reauthorize proves them right. they will wait us out and have more will and dedication than we do. Number 3, failure will result in some number of people who wouldn't have been trafficked and exploited being trafficked and exploited. And finally, when it is finally reauthorized at some future point in time, hopefully sooner rather than later, we will then be spending years playing catch-up for the time we lost.
Well, let me thank all of you. This has been a fascinating panel. I really appreciate the information you provided us, and you've given us a lot to think about. And again, I will reiterate my offer, which is if you have ideas of things that we can do, please let us know, and we look forward to working with you. And again, thank you for all of your work in this field. Appreciate it. Thank you.